Before dawn's first light touched the red dust of Nkabira, the city had already begun its song of cruelty. It was a music woven from the cries of traders, the laughter of the wealthy, and the rustle of coins sliding into greedy hands. Amid this chaos walked a boy too small for the burdens he carried, a boy whose name was a wound disguised as a word. They called him worthless, not in anger, but in habit, as though his pain had become part of the marketplace rhythm, as ordinary as the smell of spice and sweat that hung in the air. Nkabira was a city that dressed its sins in beauty. Its streets shone gold at sunrise, but beneath that shimmer lived the dust of the forgotten, the men who bowed too quickly, the women who sold hope by handfuls, and the children who learned early that hunger has no patience. And among them moved Tunde, barefoot, thin, his ribs visible beneath a torn shirt that fluttered like a dying flag. Each morning, he lifted baskets heavier than his small body could bear. Each evening, he returned them empty, his reward no greater than the sting of laughter. Yet through all the mockery and the sweat, his eyes never lowered in surrender. There was a strange stillness in them, a quiet defiance that refused to break. He listened, he watched, he memorized the rhythm of trade, the deception hidden in smiles, the power buried in patience. He saw how merchants could twist words into gold, how greed disguised itself as ambition, and how survival was just another kind of bargain. The market became his classroom, the cruelty of others his lesson, and though he had no father, no teacher, and no coin to call his own, he began to understand what no one around him cared to notice, that wealth did not belong to those who had money, but to those who could endure. As the sun climbed high and the dust grew thick, he paused by a wall of red clay, his breath shallow, his thoughts racing faster than his pulse. His stomach groaned, but he smiled through the pain, whispering a promise only he could hear. "One day," he said softly, "they'll remember the boy they called worthless." The words lingered in the air, fragile but alive, carried by the wind through the noise of the market. Evening came, stretching its shadow across the city. The traders packed their goods, their laughter fading into the distance, but Tunde stayed behind, sweeping the floor of the empty stalls, collecting the spoiled fruit and spilled grain that others had left. He ate little, saving most for those who hungrier than himself. And when he finally sat, the world seemed quiet for the first time that day. The last light of sunset spilled across his face, and for a moment, the boy who owned nothing looked like a king in exile, unseen, unrecognized, but destined. Night descended suddenly, heavy with the scent of rain. Clouds crawled over the city, and the wind turned sharp, bending the thin stalls until they moaned like old spirits. Tunde drew his knees to his chest beneath, a sheet of torn cloth, the storm's cold reaching his bones. But he did not sleep. His mind wandered, through memories of his mother, through the ache of hunger, through the stubborn question of why life seemed to spare everyone but him. Yet even as the rain began to pour, even as thunder rolled over the rooftops, he whispered again, half to himself, half to the stars hidden behind the storm, "You'll need me, all of you. One day, you'll need me." The wind howled harder, slashing through the narrow streets as lightning flashed above. Through the curtain of rain, a tall figure appeared at the far end of the market, his silhouette framed by the flickering light of a dying lantern. He did not move at first, only watched the boy with an expression Tunde could not read, part sorrow, part recognition. The lantern flame bent low, then steadied again, as if afraid to die. And in that trembling light, the two remained locked in silence, one drenched and shivering, the other shadowed and still, unaware that destiny had just chosen its moment to arrive. Destiny came dressed in rags, walking through the rain like a forgotten story, seeking a voice. The storm had not yet passed when the old traveler appeared, his robe soaked, his face half hidden beneath a hood, his steps slow but certain, as if each one carried the weight of 1,000 miles. When he stopped before the shivering boy, his eyes met Tunde's with an understanding that neither hunger nor time could explain. In that moment, the silence between them spoke louder than the thunder, two souls recognizing the shape of their own survival in each other's gaze. The man introduced himself simply, Baba Kuti. His voice was worn smooth, like stone shaped by water, and his words carried the steady rhythm of experience. He asked for nothing but a place to rest, yet when Tunde pushed his own mat closer to share warmth, the traveler smiled, not out of pity, but out of respect. "You gave when you had nothing," he said softly, his accent thick and deep. "That kind of giving is remembered by the earth." They shared what little they had, a handful of grain roasted over a trembling fire. While the rain whispered against the broken roof, Baba Kuti told stories of lands beyond the desert, of markets where fairness was worth more than gold, and of kings who lost their crowns because they forgot the poor. Tunde listened with wide, unblinking eyes, the world in those tales larger than anything he had imagined. Each word planted something inside him, not hope, for hope was fragile, but belief, that slow, stubborn fire that keeps burning long after dreams have died. Days turned into weeks. Baba Kuti stayed, teaching not through lectures, but through living. He showed Tunde how to look at a thing not for what it was, but for what it could become. A trader's greatest tool is not his hands, he would say. It is his mind. The world throws away what it does not understand. Learn to see the hidden value, and you will never be poor again. Together they gathered discarded grain from the mills, dried it in the sun, and sold it for less than others dared. The poor came first, old women, children, men whose eyes carried defeat, and Tunde gave them food without arrogance, remembering what it meant to starve. He began to notice something new. For the first time, people were saying his name, not as an insult, but as gratitude. "Tunde fed us," they whispered, and those words were sweeter than coin. He watched Baba Kuti work with quiet grace, no rush, no greed, just understanding. The old man never took more than needed, never raised his voice, never mocked those who stumbled. In his presence, Tunde found the father he had never known, and the purpose he had always longed for. Baba Kuti often spoke while watching the horizon, his voice drifting like smoke. "The world is full of noise, my boy. Don't let it drown your worth. When they call you worthless, remember, the earth called you seed first." Every evening, they returned to their corner of the market and shared small victories. A bag sold, a customer returning, a smile earned. And as the city slept, they would sit by the dying fire, the glow painting their faces gold. "You see," Baba Kuti would say, "fortune doesn't come to the loud. It comes to the patient. Hunger sharpens the mind. Patience feeds it." And Tunde would nod, repeating the words until they became prayer. But even peace has its storms. As the weeks passed, Baba Kuti's cough deepened, his hands trembling more each morning. Tunde noticed but said nothing. Fear was a stranger he had learned to ignore. The old man would smile, brushing off concern, whispering that the world was too wide for worry. Yet one night, as the wind moved through the empty market, Baba Kuti stared into the fire longer than usual. "If I go," he murmured, "do not mourn me. Build. Build where they broke you." Tunde frowned, not understanding. "You're not going anywhere," he said, forcing a grin. "You still have to show me the markets across the desert." Baba Kuti chuckled, his eyes distant. "Perhaps I already have," he whispered. The next morning, dawn came without him. The fire was cold. The space beside Tunde's mat was empty. The market woke to its usual noise, but the world felt different. Too quiet. Too wide. Panic clawed at Tunde's chest as he searched the stalls, calling the name that had become part of his heart. No one had seen the traveler. No one even remembered him arriving. It was as though he had stepped out of a dream. Tunde returned to their shelter, the weight of loss pressing harder than any hunger he had known. He sat on the floor where Baba Kuti had once rested and felt something smooth beneath his palm. There, half buried in the dust, lay a small carved wooden token, the kind traders carried for luck. His breath caught as he turned it over. Words were etched into the surface, crude but clear. "Build where they broke you." He stared at the token for a long time, the letters burning themselves into his memory. The rain began again outside, soft and steady, as if the sky itself mourned with him. Tunde clenched the token in his hand and lifted his eyes to the horizon, where the first light of dawn split the clouds. The old man was gone, but his voice remained, whispering through the wind, commanding him to rise. And somewhere deep within, the worthless boy felt the first pulse of destiny, calling him home. Death came for Adana, the way dusk comes for the light, slow, tender, inevitable. The small room smelled of rain and wood smoke when Tunde returned, the carved token from Baba Kuti still warm in his hand. His mother lay on a mat, woven with age and poverty, her breath thin, her eyes bright with the stubborn pride of a woman who had endured too much for too long. "Feed them," she whispered, her voice trembling like a candle before wind, "even when they starve your heart." Each word pressed into him like fire-branding iron. Each breath she fought to take became another thread in the vow that would bind him forever. The storm outside raged as if the heavens themselves were mourning. Tunde knelt beside her, his body shaking with disbelief. He tried to speak, but the tears stole his voice. The same hands that had washed his wounds now felt fragile as paper beneath his touch. She smiled faintly, her gaze resting not on the room, but somewhere beyond it. "They will call you many names, my son," she murmured, "but never forget what you are. The soil knows the seed that will rise." Then, before he could answer, the breath left her body, soft and final, like the closing of a story. Silence swallowed the house. The roof dripped in rhythm with his heartbeat, and for a moment he sat there, unable to move, staring at the stillness that used to be life. Outside, thunder rolled through the fields. He stood slowly, feeling the hollowness where her voice had lived, and realized that grief was not the same as weakness. It was a forge. Before dawn, he dug the grave himself beneath the old neem tree, the rain soaking through his clothes until earth and skin became one color. Each handful of soil he lifted was a conversation, each drop of rain another word he could not say. He laid her down, wrapped in cloth, whispering apologies for all the meals he could not give her, the shelter he could not build. When he covered her face for the last time, he pressed Baba Kuti's token into her palm. "He told me to build where they broke me," he said softly. "You told me to feed them. I will do both." The sky grumbled like an old god waking. Around him, the city stretched silent under the storm, unaware that its savior was being forged in mud and loss. Tunde stayed kneeling long after the grave was filled, watching rain strike the mound until it shone like polished stone. Every memory returned: the laughter of the ear, market, the faces that had spat at him, the warmth of Baba Kuti's fire, the steady voice of his mother. All of them circled inside him like a storm with no center. He spoke aloud, not shouting but steady, his words sinking into the soaked earth. "I will not beg again. I will not live in their shadow. I will rise, and when I do, no one will hunger in this city again." Lightning flashed, illuminating his small frame against the darkness. For an instant the rain stopped, as if even the clouds were listening. The promise left his mouth and hung in the air, heavier than the storm, older than the boy who spoke it. He pressed his palm to the ground, sealing the vow. The mud felt warm beneath his fingers, alive, as though the earth had accepted his oath. He stood then, tall, despite exhaustion, his silhouette carved against the burning sky. Around him the wind howled through the trees, scattering leaves and dust, carrying his mother's spirit toward the horizon. The marketplace lights in the distance flickered like dying embers, and he realized that his old life, of servitude, hunger, and mockery, had died with her. What remained was something raw, sharpened, unstoppable. A blinding flash tore across the heavens, splitting the neem tree clean down its middle, one half smoldering, the other still green. The thunder that followed shook the ground beneath his feet, echoing like a declaration. Tunde stared at the burning trunk, the symbol clear even to a boy who owned nothing. Part of him had been claimed by death, but part of him had just been born. He turned toward the city lights shimmering through the rain, his face calm, his eyes fierce. The world had taken everything from him. Now it would watch what he became. From the filth of the markets and the mockery of men, Tunde began to build what no one believed could exist. From scraps that others kicked aside, from the dust that clung to the souls of the proud, he found the seeds of something greater. Every piece of spoiled grain, every half-rotten cob of corn, every bag thrown away as worthless became to him a treasure. He washed them clean, dried them in the sun, and sold them to the hungry who could no longer afford the food sold by those who once laughed at him. The work was endless and rough. His hands cracked, his back scarred by sun and strain. Yet there was something sacred in the labor. The same people who once chased him away from their stalls now came quietly at dusk, eyes lowered, asking if he still had grain left. And he would give it, never for profit, always for purpose. The poor began to speak his name, softly in gratitude, and their whispers moved through the market like the first breath of dawn. Still, the rich sneered. "Look at him," they laughed, "the boy of garbage." But even their cruelty began to sound nervous, because beneath their laughter was fear. Fear of a boy who was no longer begging, but building. He never shouted back. He simply worked, gathering from the iwa, ground what the world threw away, turning mockery into movement. And slowly, coins began to gather. Not many, but enough to build a small wooden stall in the very center of the marketplace. It was humble, nothing but a table of rough planks and a torn canopy, but when the morning light touched it, it glowed. The stall became a place where the hungry came first. Children came with bowls, mothers came with prayers. The air around it began to change. Where greed had lived, gratitude began to take root. Tunde named his stall Eden's Grain. When asked why, he said softly, "Because everything grows from what we thought was lost." It was not just a business, it was redemption disguised as trade. The same market that had once been a place of his humiliation was now the ground of his resurrection. But success, even the smallest kind, has a way of stirring the sleeping beasts of envy. As his stall grew, so did the whispers. Merchants muttering that the boy's grain was cursed, that his kindness was a mask, that he sought to shame the wealthy with pity. Tunde ignored it, as he had always ignored cruelty. But this time, their words carried weight. They were no longer just insults. They were warnings. He began to notice unfamiliar eyes following him home at night, strangers standing too long beside his stall, questions that carried venom in their softness. Still he worked through it, his faith stronger than fear. He remembered his mother's words beneath the neem tree, "Feed them, even when they starve your heart." And each time the memory rose, it gave him strength to continue. The rainy season came and passed. The poor of Nkabira had grain when others starved. His stall grew into 2, then 3, the wood replaced by stone, the stone painted with symbols of unity. For the first time in years, Tunde smiled when he passed through the market that once mocked him. But as peace returned to his heart, trouble began to gather around him, like the smell of smoke before a fire. On a moonless night, when the city lay silent under the breath of the wind, the smell of kerosene filled the air. A flicker danced at the edge of the market, and then another. Within minutes, flames roared high into the darkness, devouring wood, cloth, and dreams. People shouted, running toward the light, but it was already too late. As Tunde stood in the distance, the fire painting his face in gold and red, he understood. Envy had finally come to test his resolve. By morning, Eden's grain was gone. The fire had swallowed everything: the stalls, the grain, even the coins he had buried beneath the floorboards. Only ashes remained, scattered like the pieces of his faith. Yet among the ruins stood Tunde, barefoot, his clothes singed, his eyes steady and dry. Ashes covered his dream, yet his spirit stood unburned. The people came in silence, the same ones who had once called him worthless, now weeping for what he had lost. But Tunde didn't weep. He looked at the charred remains of his stall, then at the faces around him, and said quietly, "Fire only tests what deserves to last." His voice did not tremble. It rang clear, carried by the morning wind. He began to rebuild before the embers cooled. This time he gathered clay from the riverbank and mixed it with straw and stone. Each wall he raised was thicker, stronger, defying both flame and fear. Farmers from nearby villages came to help, men who had once ignored him now offering grain and hands. They had seen what he stood for, and in his fall they found something of their own dignity reflected back at them. For weeks he worked without rest. The city watched in disbelief. The boy they had tried to destroy was rising higher than before. When the new storehouse finally stood finished, it dwarfed every other stall in the market. Its walls gleamed red beneath the sun, a fortress of humility and hope. He opened it, not with speeches or celebrations, but with quiet generosity. The first grain he sold went to a widow who had lost everything in the same fire. When she tried to thank him, he shook his head. "The fire took what was weak," he said. "It gave me what was strong." The whispers that followed him through the market no longer carried laughter. Some spoke of fear, others of respect. His name spread beyond Nkabira, Tunde, the boy who outlived the fire. The rich merchants, watching their profits fall, grew restless. They met in secret halls thick with incense and bitterness, plotting how to break the boy who refused to kneel. They spoke of power, of reputation, of lineage, as if all those things could stand against the simple courage of a soul that had already burned and survived. But Tunde no longer walked as he once had. There was a calmness in him now, a stillness that unnerved those who mistook kindness for weakness. He had learned from Baba Kuti that wealth was not in coin, but in control. Control of mind, control of purpose, control of what the world could not take. He stood often at the edge of the market, watching the smoke rise from other chimneys, smelling the bread he could not yet afford to buy, and he smiled, because he knew now what the fire had given him. Not ruin, but renewal. In the heart of the night, behind the carved doors of the Golden Market, the city's most powerful traders gathered in secret. Candles burned low, shadows thickened, and one voice whispered above the rest, "He is no longer a boy. If we do not stop him now, he will own us all." Outside, unaware of the storm forming behind those walls, Tunde stood beneath the stars, his hand on the door of his new storehouse, feeling the warmth of the earth rise beneath his feet. The fire had tested him, and he had been forged unbreakable. Greed gathered in velvet rooms while the city slept. Behind the carved doors of the Golden Market, where candles burned low and wine whispered secrets, the wealthiest men of Nkabira plotted the ruin of one who had risen too far. Their rings clinked against crystal, their silks rustled like serpents in the dark, and the name that trembled on every tongue was Tunde. They had built their power on control. Control of grain, control of hunger, control of the city's pulse. And now a boy, once mocked as worthless, was threatening to rewrite the order of things. In the months after the fire, Tunde's storehouses had become the lifeblood of Nkabira. From the palace kitchens to the poorest alley, his grain-fed mouths that had forgotten the taste of enough. The rich despised him because he owed them nothing. The poor revered him because he remembered them. His name had become a story, told at wells and whispered at weddings, the boy who rose from ashes to feed a city. The Golden Market's merchants could not bear it. Their wealth depended on scarcity, their power on starvation. They sat around their long tables that night, their laughter sharp as broken glass, inventing ways to rot a reputation they could not touch with honesty. "Call his stores cursed," one hissed. "Say his grain is mixed with the ashes of the dead," said another. "Raise the prices of our own," said the eldest among them, his voice oily with certainty. "Let the city feel hunger again, and they'll turn on him like dogs." By dawn, the rumors had spread like fever. Traders who once partnered with Tunde refused to speak his name. Customers hesitated at his door, whispering curses of sickness, of witchcraft. Prices soared. Debts multiplied. The same hands that had once shaken him now pointed with accusation. His allies drifted away one by one, frightened not by proof, but by lies dressed as truth. Tunde did not fight the rumors. He had learned long ago that words could not be killed with more words. He simply worked. He sold his grain quietly, took less profit, and kept his promise. No one would starve while he still breathed. Yet at night, as he lay awake listening to the wind scrape against his clay walls, he felt the sting of betrayal like a wound reopening. He thought of Baba Kuti, of his mother beneath the neem tree, and he whispered to them both, "They broke my name, but they will not break my purpose." When the merchants tightened their grip, buying out suppliers and cutting off his stock, he did the unthinkable. He left the city. He walked for days through dry fields and sleeping villages, following trails of dust until he reached the lands beyond Nkabira's pride, where farmers worked in silence, and soil spoke louder than gold. He traded fairly, honestly, giving them tools, seed, and food in exchange for loyalty. "I will not buy your grain," he told them. "I will grow it with you." The farmers, long cheated by city merchants, saw in him a leader, not a buyer. Together they forged new paths through wilderness and fear, building roads of trust where greed had once ruled. Seasons turned. Where others saw famine, Tunde saw harvest. While the Golden Market gorged itself on arrogance, he built his empire quietly in the fields, an empire of faith, built not on coin, but on the sweat of those who still believed in work that fed rather than consumed. When he returned to Nkabira, the city was starving. The markets were half empty, the rich merchants pale with panic. No grain carts rolled through their gates. No supplies came from the farms they once exploited. The Golden Market had turned on itself, and hunger had found its way even to their gold-lined tables. Then one morning, the city awoke to the sound of wagons rumbling through its gates. Tunde's wagons. Row after row of them, heavy with grain, bearing the mark of his new trade route. The people flooded the streets, cheering, weeping, reaching out to touch the man they had once mocked. And as the merchants watched from their balconies, their faces pale as the ashes of their greed, they understood too late. The boy they had tried to destroy now controlled the flow of food itself, and with it, the heartbeat of the city. Panic began to bloom where power once lived, for Nkabira now belonged to the one it had once called worthless. The sky closed like a fist, and hunger began to walk the streets of Nkabira in human form. The sun burned without mercy for months, turning the rivers to bone and the fields to dust. Clouds that once danced above the city vanished as if in exile, and the laughter that once filled the market now came out as coughs of despair. The scent of roasted grain and fruit that had once defined Nkabira's mornings disappeared, replaced by the smell of heat and hopelessness. In that silence of dying earth, only one name rose like a prayer on the people's lips, Tunde. The drought came like punishment, but no one knew whose sin had summoned it. The merchants blamed the farmers blamed the gods, and the palace blamed everyone but itself. Yet when wells began to echo hollow, when children fainted from thirst, when mothers boiled stones to silence the cries of their babies, all eyes turned to the man whose granaries stood tall against the horizon. The boy once called worthless. Inside his warehouses, the air was heavy with the scent of grain, the promise of survival. He stood before his workers, their faces lined with fear, their questions unspoken. "We will open the doors," he said. "No one in this city will die while food still fills these walls." His voice carried no hesitation, no calculation. It was not charity. It was purpose, made flesh. The first day he opened the storehouses, the line stretched beyond sight. Men who had never lowered their heads before bowed in silence. Women clutched their children, eyes hollow with exhaustion, but alive with fragile hope. The rich arrived cloaked in humility, pretending to be servants to hide their shame. And Tunde gave to them all, rich and poor alike, without record, without price. The crowd wept openly, calling him Baba Grain, savior of the city, son of mercy. The sound of their gratitude filled the same streets that once spat on his name. Where mockery had once echoed, now prayers rose, soft and trembling, carried by the wind like music. But even as he smiled at their relief, he knew the truth. His grain would not last forever. Every sack that left his warehouse shortened the line between salvation and scarcity. He prayed for rain each night, standing on the same soil that had once buried his mother, whispering to her spirit that he was still feeding them as promised. Days bled into weeks, and still the sky remained a cruel, empty canvas. The city's wells dried, the river shrank to mud, and animals began to die where they stood. The merchants of the golden market came crawling back, begging for trade, their silks tattered, their arrogance gone. Tunde listened, but said little. He had learned the language of loss, and theirs spoke only of greed. In the heart of Nkabira, where once had stood the marketplace of mockery, there now rose a new sight, a breadline of gratitude. The poor who received food left behind not coins, but blessings, tokens of thanks, beads, carvings, songs. They gave what little they could, and it filled his heart more than gold ever could. But behind this miracle, there was danger. The palace watched his growing influence with unease. Courtiers whispered to the king that the people now knelt to another ruler. "A merchant feeds them," they said, "and they praise him more than their own crown." In the royal halls, jealousy began to brew, silent, slow, poisonous. Tunde knew nothing of the murmurs. He continued his work, guided only by the oath he had sworn beneath the neem tree. Feed them, even when they starve your heart. Each night, he would stand before his mother's grave in his mind, reporting what he had done, as if she were still there, listening beneath the earth. Then, one evening, the wind changed. A hot, strange wind from the east swept through the city, lifting the dust in swirling columns. People looked up, startled. It was the first movement in the sky in months. The air carried a new sound, hooves. From the distance came riders cloaked in royal blue, their banners heavy with the crest of King Adoro. The marketplace fell silent as the horses thundered toward Tunde's storehouse. He stepped outside to meet them, his clothes simple, his hands streaked with flour and sweat. The lead rider dismounted, his armor glinting faintly under the dying sun. He bowed briefly, then unrolled a parchment sealed with crimson wax. The seal bore the mark of the throne, the lion and the spear. His voice carried across the crowd like the crack of a whip. "Tunde, son of Adana," he announced. "By royal order, His Majesty King Adoro commands your presence at the palace." Gasps rippled through the gathering. No merchant had ever been summoned by the king in living memory. Some murmured that he would be rewarded. Others feared he would be condemned. Tunde said nothing. He looked past the Asiodhya messenger toward the horizon, where the sun, swollen and red, touched the edge of the earth. He felt again the same stillness that had filled him the night the stranger first appeared at his stall. The stillness before destiny speaks. As the royal messengers waited, their horses restless in the dust, Tunde wiped his hands on his tunic and turned to his men. "Keep feeding them," he said quietly. "The king can wait, but hunger cannot." Then he faced the riders, eyes steady, heart unshaken. "Tell your king," he said, "I am coming." And as he walked toward the palace gates, the crowd parted in reverent silence, whispering his name not as a plea this time, but as prophecy. Power bowed before the boy it once rejected, and the palace that had once ignored his hunger now opened its golden doors to welcome him. The throne room of King Adoro glimmered under the light of 100 torches, its marble floor reflecting the faces of courtiers who whispered his name with awe and suspicion. Tunde, the boy the streets once called worthless, stood before a throne carved from ivory and wrapped in gold. And for the first time in Nakabira's history, the king himself rose to greet a commoner. The air inside the palace was thick with perfume and fear. Courtiers in silks lined the walls, their smiles brittle, their eyes sharp. Some bowed low out of respect, others out of strategy. But Tunde saw through them all. He could still smell the marketplace in his memory, the sweat, the dust, the truth. He was not dazzled by marble or crowns. He had lived too long among dirt to be blinded by polish. King Adoro was not a cruel man, but he was a weary one. Years of drought and deceit had aged him beyond his time. He looked at Tunde with a mix of admiration and unease, for this young man had done what the crown could not: feed the people. When he spoke, his voice echoed through the high hall. "You have saved my city," he said, "and in doing so, you have saved my throne. For that, I owe you more than words." He descended the steps of the dais, the jewels of his robe catching the light, and extended his hand. "From this day forward, I name you chief of trade for all of Nkabira. You will oversee the markets, the farms, and the flow of food across my kingdom." Gasps fluttered through the hall. No commoner had ever been granted such a title. Tunde bowed, but his heart did not bow with him. He saw in the king's gesture both honor and temptation. To serve the crown meant to stand between wealth and the hungry, between justice and greed. He looked around the chamber, the carved pillars, the golden bowls, the painted ceilings, and thought of the faces outside, the ones still lined up for food. His decision was quiet, deliberate. "If I serve," he said, "I will serve the people, not the palace." The king smiled faintly, a man too tired to argue with the truth. "Then serve well," he replied, "for the people are the blood of the throne. Now to you was I." So began Tunde's reign, not of power, but of purpose. Under his guidance, trade became honest. The roads cleared, the markets bloomed, the warehouses filled once more. Food flowed through Nkabira like lifeblood returning to a wounded body. Prices fell, fairness rose, and the sound of laughter, real laughter, returned to the streets. Mothers sang again at wells. Children ran through fields, and the city that had once mocked him now chanted his name with pride. But in the shadows of that new prosperity, jealousy grew teeth. The courtiers who had once controlled the markets now watched helplessly as their fortunes thinned. The merchants of the golden market, broken by drought and deceit, whispered in dark corners about revenge. They could not bear the sight of a barefoot boy walking freely through palace halls, speaking to kings as an equal. To them, his humility was not virtue. It was insult. Tunde felt the tension, but ignored it. He had no time for envy. His eyes were fixed on rebuilding the country's heart. He visited farms beyond the city, promising fair prices to the growers. He stood in the markets listening to mothers and traders alike, his presence as steady as the dawn. He refused bribes, refused favors, refused to wear the heavy robes offered to him. "A man forgets how to serve when his clothes weigh more than his duty," he told his aides. But envy, once born, does not die easily. It hides in laughter, in the rustle of silk, in the faint whisper of secrets carried by servants through midnight halls. The palace that had once celebrated him now watched him too closely. The same mouths that cheered his name began to twist it into questions. Who was he to rise so fast? What spell had he cast over the people? What loyalty did he owe the throne? And what loyalty did the throne owe him? And so, even as Nkabira flourished, a chill began to creep through its golden corridors. The same light that had lifted him up now cast new shadows behind his back. He would hear footsteps that stopped when he turned, voices that fell silent as he entered. And deep within, he felt it, the old familiar presence of danger, the echo of the storm that had never truly passed. One evening, as the palace bells marked the fall of dusk, Tunde stood on the balcony overlooking the city he had saved. The rooftops gleamed beneath the fading light, and the wind carried the distant murmur of his name sung in gratitude. But behind him, in the shadowed corridor, soft voices whispered like the hiss of blades being drawn. Envy had sharpened its knife, and the palace that once bowed to him was beginning to prepare for betrayal. The city's savior became its prisoner before the moon completed its journey across the sky. In the same streets where the people once chanted his name, whispers of treachery now drifted like poison through the air. By dawn, the word thief clung to Tunde's name, the way worthless once had, and the city that had once bowed to him spat his name, with venom. The betrayal was swift, sharp, and perfectly planned. The wound delivered not by strangers, but by the hands he had fed. The conspiracy that had been whispering through the palace corridors finally bared its teeth. Jealous ministers, led by the merchants he had once defied, had spent weeks spinning webs of deceit, forging records, planting false ledgers, and twisting his generosity into evidence of greed. To the king, they painted a picture of a man who had grown too powerful, who had used the city's hunger to build an empire of loyalty. He feeds them not for kindness, but for control, they warned. If you do not chain him now, he will crown himself tomorrow. King Adoro, weary and suspicious, fell silent before their accusations. His mind, once clear, clouded with fear, not of Tunde's betrayal, but of losing the adoration that had once belonged only to the throne. That night, under the cover of darkness, soldiers received their orders. They moved like shadows through the sleeping palace, the clink of armor drowned by the whispers of conspiracy. Tunde, unaware of the storm about to break, worked late in his chambers, signing trade permits and organizing food routes for the villages still recovering from drought. He paused when he heard the faint echo of boots in the corridor, but before he could speak, the door burst open. Armed guards flooded the room. "By royal decree," their captain announced, "Tunde, son of Adana, chief of trade, you are under arrest for theft and treason against the crown." The words struck him like thunder. For a moment he stood frozen, the ink drying on his fingers, his heart refusing to believe what his ears had heard. "Theft?" he repeated quietly, the word tasting like ash. "From whom?" The captain did not answer. Rough hands seized him, tearing away the token from Babakuti that still hung from his neck. Chains closed around his wrists, cold and heavy, biting into skin that had known the weight of labor, but not of accusation. As they dragged him through the corridors, the marble floors echoed with each step, a sound like the slow breaking of faith. Outside, the people gathered, drawn by the commotion. Soldiers shouted that their chief of trade had betrayed them, that he had stolen grain meant for the poor, that his warehouses were filled with riches hidden from the king. The crowd gasped, murmured, hesitated, and then, as fear always does, turned to fury. The same mouths that had once blessed him now cursed him. Rotten fruit flew, Spit struck his face, and words became stones. "Fraud!" they shouted. "Deceiver!" Tunde lowered his eyes, not from shame, but from heartbreak. He had fed them, clothed them, protected them, and still they believed the lie. He did not resist. He walked quietly as the guards pushed him toward the palace gates, his mind drifting to his mother beneath the neem tree, to Baba Kuti's wisdom whispered by firelight. The world will test what it cannot break. Perhaps this was the test. Perhaps this was the cost of purpose. The dungeon was cold and smelled of rust and regret. They chained him to the wall, his only company the slow drip of water echoing through the dark. For the first time in years, he felt small again, the same boy who had slept beneath the stalls of the marketplace. Yet beneath the ache, something still burned. Not anger, not despair, but the faint warmth of unyielding resolve. They could chain his hands, but they could not chain what he had become. Hours passed, or days. Time had no meaning in that pit of silence. He closed his eyes and thought of the people he had fed, the city he had healed, the oath he had sworn to his mother. He whispered to the darkness, "You can bury truth in chains, but it will still feed the world." From somewhere beyond the dripping walls, a sound rose. A voice, old and familiar, cutting through the dark, like dawn through smoke. "Fire cannot kill purpose," it said, soft but certain, carrying the rhythm of memory. Tunde froze, his heart hammering. The air trembled with recognition. Baba Kuti's voice, impossible yet undeniable, echoed through the stone. And as Tunde lifted his head toward the sound, hope flickered back to life, small but fierce, refusing to die. Hope returned wearing the face of an old teacher, a face that time and distance could not erase. When the dungeon door creaked open and torchlight spilled into the darkness, Tunde believed it was another trick of the mind, another whisper of the past meant to mock him. But as the shadows parted, there he stood, Baba Kuti, older, thinner, but unchanged in the eyes. The same calm flame that had once guided a lost boy now burned brighter, reflected in the wet stone walls that had been Tunde's prison. "Come, my son," the old man said softly, his voice cutting through the rust and silence. "The world still needs what you were born to build." The chains that had bound him fell away, with a clatter that sounded like thunder breaking over the hills. His knees buckled, his body trembling not from weakness, but from disbelief. "I buried you in my memories," Tunde murmured, his voice breaking. "And yet you stand before me." Baba Kuti smiled gently. "You buried what you needed to forget. I have come to remind you of what must live." Outside, the night was vast and cold, the air sharp with the scent of freedom. They moved like shadows through the palace corridors, guided by paths only Baba Kuti seemed to know. The old man's steps were sure, his silence heavy with purpose. Beyond the palace walls, horses waited, lean, silent beasts that carried them into the wilderness. Behind them, Nkabira slept unaware that its savior had been unchained. For days they rode across barren plains, through villages cracked by drought, over hills bleached by the unforgiving sun. The world stretched out like an open wound, every horizon a reminder of what greed had cost. Tunde spoke little, his heart heavy with memories of betrayal and loss, but Baba Kuti's presence was medicine to his spirit. "Do not curse the darkness that chased you here," the old man said as they rode. "Without it, you would never have found the valley where light begins again." When they finally reached it, dawn was rising behind them, a thin pale light spilling across the land like a promise kept. Before them lay a valley hidden between twin ridges, untouched by drought, watered by underground streams that whispered against the roots of green trees. It was a place of impossible beauty, fertile and waiting, as though the earth itself had been holding its breath for their arrival. "This," Baba Kuti said, spreading his arms, "is your second beginning." They worked as they once had, teacher and student, builder and believer, reclaiming the land from neglect. They dug channels for the water, raised granaries from clay, and carved paths for trade where none had existed before. The valley became their forge, the sun their witness, the soil their covenant. Slowly, word spread beyond the hills that a new land was rising under Tunde's hand, a place where no one went hungry, where trade was fair, and where generosity was not weakness but law. Farmers came from across the kingdom, drawn by rumor and hope. They brought seeds and stories, tools and tears, and under Tunde's guidance, they learned not just to plant, but to protect. The grain road begins here, he told them, and it must never end in hunger. They called him Master of the Grain Road, a title he never sought but quietly accepted, not as power, but as purpose fulfilled. In the evenings, he and Baba Kuti would sit by the water's edge, the smell of grain and wet earth thick in the air. They spoke of destiny, of men who break and rebuild, of cities that forget and remember too late. You see now, Baba Kuti would say, the world calls you worthless until it needs you. But it is never the city that defines the man. It is what the man leaves behind when the city is gone. Tunde smiled, looking toward the mountains that hid Nkabira from view. She will call again, he said, his voice steady but distant. Cities always call when they are starving. Baba Kuti nodded, his eyes knowing, his hands folded as though in prayer. And he was right. Far beyond the valley, beyond the reach of mercy, Nkabira's proud merchants were watching their markets rot. The warehouses were empty, the fields cracked open, the riverbeds dry. Hunger had returned to the city like a forgotten ghost, and the same voices that once cursed his name now cried it to the wind. Tunde, they shouted. Tunde, son of Adana, feed us once more. But the valley was far, and the boy they had broken was now a man who understood the worth of waiting. The world that had betrayed him was about to learn that destiny, like grain, returns only to those who have learned to sow it with humility. The proud now knelt in the dust they once made him sweep. The streets of Nkabira, once swollen with laughter and arrogance, had become graveyards of silence and shame. Ministers who had dined from golden plates, merchants who had ruled the markets with cruelty, and beggars who had once mocked his raggedness, now stood side by side before his gates, their faces hollow, their pride eaten away by hunger. Their robes were torn, their crowns dimmed, their voices trembling with the same desperation he had once carried alone. The boy they had spat on had become the last door between them and death. The drought that Nkabira had ignored had now devoured it whole. The granaries of the golden market were empty, the palace kitchens cold, the once rich traders now thin as their lies. Caravans no longer came from the north. The roads were haunted by dust and memory, and from every broken corner of the city, a single name rose like incense to the heavens: Tunde. He heard them before he saw them. A river of people wound through the valley, barefoot, weeping, carrying their hunger in their eyes. From the top of his grain fortress, Tunde stood motionless, his robe simple, his feet bare upon the clay he had built. The same earth that had once buried his mother now held his empire steady. Baba Kuti, older but still strong, stood beside him. "They come as you said they would," the old man murmured. "What will you do?" Tunde did not answer. His gaze stretched beyond the crowd to the horizon that had betrayed him once, and now begged forgiveness. His heart was torn between the justice of anger and the mercy of wisdom. Memories came like shadows: the laughter of the merchants, the clang of the chains that had bitten his wrists, the cries of the people who had turned against him. But then he remembered his mother's final breath, her whisper beneath the neem tree: "Feed them, even when they starve your heart." When the crowd reached the gates, silence fell. The mighty ministers knelt first, pressing their jeweled hands into the dirt. "Chief Tunde," one stammered, "forgive us. Feed us, and the crown shall be yours." Behind him, merchants lowered their heads, and beggars wept openly, their cries merging into a single desperate plea. Tunde looked at them, his expression calm, but unreadable. "You called me worthless when I had nothing," he said, his voice deep as thunder rolling across dry plains. "You chained me for giving too much, and now you come, empty, asking to take again." The people bowed lower, their tears darkening the dust. Baba Kuti's hand rested on his shoulder. "The test is not how you rise, my son," he said softly, "but what you do when others fall." Tunde closed his eyes, and the valley seemed to hold its breath. He saw again the face of his mother, her eyes filled with pain, but not hate. When he opened them, his decision had already been made. "Feed them all," he said, his voice steady, his heart breaking and healing at once. "Let hunger never speak my name." Again, the gates opened, and grain flowed out like salvation. The hungry fell to their knees as the smell of food filled the air once more. Mothers clutched their children, men wept without shame, and the sound of hope returned to Nkabira like rain after years of drought. But even as he watched them eat, a deep sadness settled in Tunde's chest. He knew forgiveness came at the cost of forgetting, and he had no desire to be forgotten again. Days passed, and the city began to breathe once more. The people rebuilt their homes, their laughter returning slowly, cautiously. Yet among the joyous noise, Tunde remained distant, walking the valley's edge at dusk, listening to the wind. Baba Kuti would often find him there, staring toward the city lights. "You have done what kings failed to do," the old man would say. "Why do you still carry sorrow?" Tunde smiled faintly. "Because mercy feeds the body," he replied, "but truth feeds the soul, and they still do not understand the cost." One evening, as the last of the grain was being distributed, the crowd parted suddenly. A hush fell like a curtain drawn tight. From the path that led to the valley's heart, a royal procession approached, soldiers in tattered armor, banners hanging limp. At its center walked King Adoro, barefoot, crown in hand, his robe stained with dust and remorse. His eyes, once filled with command, now shone with shame and sorrow. As he stopped before Tunde, the king lowered his head and whispered, "The throne that ruled Nkabira no longer feeds it. Teach me, boy. How does a ruler serve?" The valley fell silent, the wind pausing in its breath, waiting for Tunde's answer. Power knelt before humility, and the city of Nkabira held its breath. The mighty King Adoro, once the voice of law and the shadow of fear, now stood before the man he had condemned. The golden crown that had outlived dynasties trembled in his hands, heavy not with gold, but with guilt. "Rule them," he said, his voice shaking. "Take what should have always been yours. Lead Nkabira, for I no longer can." Around them, the people watched. Ministers, beggars, merchants, mothers, all silent, all waiting for the boy they had called worthless to decide the fate of their world. The valley glowed beneath the morning sun, its fields alive with green, the rivers whispering softly through the land he had built from ashes. The air itself seemed to hum with destiny. Tunde stood tall but calm, dressed not in robes of royalty, but in the plain cloth of a farmer. His hands, still marked by the scars of labor, looked foreign against the gleaming crown. He saw in its reflection not power, but the memory of all he had endured, the laughter of the market, the sting of chains, the voice of Baba Kuti, the whisper of his mother beneath the neem tree. "Your Majesty," he said finally, his tone neither prideful nor humble, "the throne belongs to those who hunger for power. I have hungered only for justice." The king lowered his eyes, tears glinting like broken jewels. "Without you," he murmured, "this city will starve again. You built what I destroyed." Tunde stepped forward and took the crown, his fingers trembling slightly as its weight pressed into his palms. The crowd leaned closer, hope and awe rippling through their breath. He held it up, and the light of the sun caught on its edges, spilling gold across his face. For a moment, it seemed as though he might accept. The boy who had been called worthless finally ascending to rule the city that had spat on his name. But then, with the gentleness of a man laying down a burden rather than rejecting a gift, he knelt. He placed the crown on the earth between them, letting the dust cling to its jewels. "My empire feeds," he said softly, his voice carrying through the still air. "It does not rain." The words settled over the crowd like prophecy. Even the wind seemed to pause in reverence. The king bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "You are greater than I ever was," he whispered. "You have ruled not from a throne, but from the heart of men." Tunde turned to the people, his eyes shining not with pride, but with peace. "You owe me nothing," he said. "You owe each other everything. Remember what hunger taught you. Remember that mercy, once given, must live in every home, or the world will starve again." The crowd broke into tears. Men who had once mocked him fell to their knees. Women who had once turned their backs lifted their children toward him, whispering blessings. And among them, standing slightly apart, Baba Kuti smiled. Old, frail, but radiant. Their eyes met across the distance, and no words were needed. The old man had taught him how to build from nothing. Now the student had built something that would outlive them both. The king placed a hand on Tunde's shoulder and bowed low, the gesture of a servant before his master. "The crown," he said softly, "is lighter in your absence than on any head." Tunde nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Let it rest, then," he answered. "Let the city learn to carry its own light." And so, Tunde returned to his valley, to his fields, to his people. He continued to trade, to teach, to feed, never as ruler, always as servant. His name spread beyond Nkabira, carried by caravans and rivers alike. Songs were written, prayers whispered, and the story of the boy they called worthless became a legend told in every marketplace across the lands. Years later, in the center of the marketplace where it had all begun, the city raised a statue, Tunde the Worthy, carved not in gold, but in stone, his figure standing tall, one hand holding a sheaf of grain toward the sky, the other resting gently at his side. The same streets that had once cursed him now glowed with laughter, the air thick with the smell of bread and hope. And as the sun set over Nkabira, its light catching the stone face of the boy who had refused the crown, it seemed for a moment that he was smiling, not at the honor, not at the city, but at the promise he had kept. The people bowed before the statue, whispering his final words as prayer, "My empire feeds." And in that echo, carried through the streets and the soil, Tunde's legacy lived, a reminder that true kingship is not measured in crowns, but in the hearts one chooses to serve. If this story moved your heart, don't let it fade with the screen. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and tell me what part of Tunde's journey spoke to your soul. Your voice keeps these stories alive. Your presence gives them power. Stay till the next tale, because every story you hear here has a heartbeat that might just echo your own.